Today on Locked On Huskers, we'll talk about transfer portal weekend and a polar bear sighting in Lincoln, Nebraska.
You are Locked On Huskers, your daily podcast on the Nebraska Cornhuskers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Jay Foreman. I want to thank you for making Locked On Huskers your first listen each and every day. Today on Locked On Huskers, we're going to talk about the transfer portal weekend, a polar bear sighting, and a recap of men's and women's basketball. But first up, the transfer portal weekend, which is the second part of recruiting. And, the one thing about transfer portal weekend, it usually hits you either quick or either ends your recruiting. And I think Nebraska's done a really good job of initially handling the Dylan Raiola flip, which I think turned the college football recruiting news cycle upside down to the point that where it was even on the Today Show, CNN, and every single news outlet. A little bit of break, rightfully so, for Christmas break. You got to rest and recharge. But then it was like you want to be true to your word. Matt Rule said that he wanted to be 90% high school, 10% transfer portal. Especially moving forward as he's trying to build a program to where you're reloading and not rebuilding. And that's a slow, but it has to be a smart process. And so when you think about the 4 targets that they've had on campus, 2 receivers, a running back, and 2 receivers, a running back, and a linebacker, they're definitely positions of need, but also you don't have to go out there and overextend yourself as far as being too desperate. And so when you think about the 2 receivers, Isaiah Nair from Wyoming to Texas, and hopefully what we've seen that he'll be a pretty big get for Nebraska. And then also Jamal Banks, who is a pretty productive receiver from Wake Forest, about 6'4", anywhere from 200 pounds to 210 pounds, a very big, elusive receiver, can make the 50-50 catch. And then also we have the running back, a big man from Oregon, who also committed. And then we have a linebacker that came from Syracuse. So I think it's all positions that we lost a lot of players, but we needed some instant production. So when you think of the receiving core, which is probably the position that needs it the most, and when you think of the 2 receivers, it's 2 different body types. And if you wanted to do a straight comparison, maybe a Malachi Coleman to a Jalen Lloyd / Doss body type. So you have Banks, who's about 6'4", which is right along with Malachi Coleman. And then Isaiah, he's listed as 6'1", but let's say he's about 6 foot. So that's right along with Jalen Lloyd and Doss. And so he can stretch the field, but he also is an excellent route runner, tough kid. When he was at Wyoming, an interesting story about him. It was an odd night, and I was watching, I think it was a Friday night, and he was, playing for Wyoming. And there was 3 games left in the season. And I'll never forget where the commentators were like, he's averaging 20, about 20 yards a catch. He's their number 1 receiver. He's doing really well, but he'd probably be in the transfer portal in 2 weeks. And I was like, wow, they already know it, but he was such a unique prospect. And he got developed by the likes of Craig Bowl, who was the head coach at the University of Wyoming. And more importantly, Mike Grant, who was the wide receiver coach at the University of Wyoming, both former Nebraska coaches that saw something in him, developed him, and then obviously he took off. Unfortunately for him, when he signed with Texas, he tore his ACL, so that whole year was gone. And I will tell people this, the state of the Texas football program was totally different. And so what I mean by that is when you go and get a receiver out of the portal, that was a position of need, that they needed him. And then he got hurt. Well, then now as you go, obviously you got to think, Casey Thompson left. Then you bring in your quarterbacks. Quinn Ewers comes back. You start to get Worthy. You start to get the NFL type of receivers that they're getting from the high school ranks that are hitting right away. Isaiah, I think, gets caught in this weird, I call it the wash, where you're not old, where you're a wily veteran, a productive veteran, and you're not young, that you're not the new shiny Maserati car. So you're in between, especially if you're injured. To his credit, he came back healthy. Only played in a couple games, so he wasn't able to produce at the rate, but then also he wasn't probably given the chance to produce. And so that's how you get into the portal. He's looking for an opportunity to not only reestablish himself, prove himself, But the biggest thing is he's coming in with a huge chip on his shoulder, and he is coming in to prove himself to not only himself, the Nebraska fans, but maybe to the University of Texas. So that's a player that you want because he's been through a lot, right? You got to think when you come to Nebraska on a visit, and no matter what, if you just got hit by Snowmageddon like we did in the last 24 to 48 hours, you go over to the Big Red Project, you see the fanfare, you see Matt Rule, you see the facilities, and you have to think back to when you were at Wyoming, in Laramie, Wyoming. They've upgraded their facilities, but nothing's quite like Nebraska. Texas might be there. Yes, the weather is different, but just coming here on campus and how they're treated and the opportunity, I think with him coming on, and he committed this weekend or this past weekend, I think it's a great get for Nebraska. There is a little bit of risk involved, which people don't realize. When you go into the transfer portal, there is no guarantees, and there's always risk. Now, whether it's a character risk, whether it's a health risk, or it's a productivity risk. And I think with him, more or less, if he can stay healthy, he will produce. And I think he's a good enough player that he can elevate each and every quarterback on this roster, freshman, or in Heinrich Haarberg's case, he's going to be a junior, or if they bring in a transfer portal quarterback, I guess in the near future, whether he's a junior or senior, he will make him better, or make them all better, excuse me. And then we think if we can get Jamal Banks, who came on the visit, again, 6'4", anywhere from 200 to 210 pounds, very productive receiver. I think he had over 600 yards, close to 700 yards receiving at Wake Forest, and can win the 50-50 balls. I think he had 6 touchdowns. He had a great visit. Everything seemed like he was about to be a slam dunk. He didn't commit right away, so I guess that was a little bit alarming because of the time crunch, which is, I think in Nebraska they start anywhere from January 22nd, anywhere from 15th to the 22nd. I'm not really sure, but pretty soon. So you would like to think that he's going to be committed, then you'll be able to get his affairs in order, come back and get in class. He left campus without committing. There is rumor that he is at the University of Michigan because he has a couple high school teammates that I think play on the basketball team and maybe one that's on the football team. Now, for the Nebraska fan to say, "Oh, get up in arms, we don't have a chance," I would say not so fast, my friends, because University of Michigan is stacked at the wide receiver position. They had seniors this year, but they had a couple freshmen that started. And if you go back and look at the Alabama game, one of their big-time receivers was the punt returner that actually muffed the first punt. But Jim Harbaugh and his staff have enough confidence in him that they played him not only the rest of the game, but featured him in the offense. So when you think about if I'm a transfer portal junior going to be a senior, you have to look at the whole landscape, regardless if you have friends in the athletic department or athletic programs. You have to do what's best for you. Yes, it's great to go on a visit, and you could be thinking about how great it could be, but you also have to understand that where you go is going to dictate your future. I assume Jamal Banks is looking at a place to where he can go be featured and where he can be the number one guy and pile upon or do better than what he's done before at University of Wake Forest. In my opinion, and it's an unbiased opinion, I think it'd be the University of Nebraska with a big edge over Michigan if that's what you're trying to do. If you're trying to go to a ready-made program and just be a piece of the puzzle, then obviously, University of Michigan, who just won the national title less than 24 hours ago as we were recording this, is the place to be. But if you're in the transfer portal, you're looking for, potentially greener pastures and a bigger opportunity. There's no other opportunity I'd say definitely in the Big Ten, but I would probably compare the wide receiver opportunity at Nebraska is a better opportunity than any place in the nation. Yes, we have an uneasy quarterback room, but when you have the number one quarterback coming in as a freshman, another Elite 11 4-star quarterback coming in as a freshman and willing to come here, and you have Heinrich Haarberg that you're just going to assume that's going to be 2 times better than he was last year because he's in the system. He's going to work on his weaknesses and become more of an astute passer and a student of the game. I would be willing to bet that I'm going to have a successful season here in Lincoln. We will see. I think he'd be a great addition. I think if we can get him, I think that it would be the perfect portal season for Nebraska, right? You got Bly Hill in the early signing period, essentially a 6'3" corner that's 195 pounds with NFL pedigree. His dad is Leroy Hill, who was a linebacker, and he played a long time for Seattle Seahawks. So you know what he's made of. And he went to St. Francis FCS school, came in as a true freshman, started productive, 2 interceptions, I think over 6 pass breakups, and I think around 40, 42 tackles and 1 or 2 for losses. So you like that body type, long, lean, kind of a Richard Sherman type of corner with quick feet, and he has tremendous ball skills. So that's your first portal get. That's really when you sign the number 1 player out of Iowa, the number 1 player out of Georgia, the number 1 player out of Nebraska, the number 1 player out of Hawaii, and then and obviously you have the biggest flip, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years as far as recruiting goes. Bly Hill can get a little bit overshadowed, and that'd be as your first portal get. But you got to think Nebraska moved on him quick. He had a lot of offers in the Big Ten, so you feel like there's a lot of other universities and coaches and coordinators think he's a Big Ten player. That's a huge get for Nebraska. We got Isaiah Nair, the receiver. That's a huge get. And then if we can get Jamal Banks, I think when you can get 2 veterans to come in, 2 different body types to where you want to insert guys into your wide receiver room, that's not only going to be productive, but teach the guys how to work. So what you want is 2 years from now, those guys to impersonate what they've seen from any type of portal get that you guys get in any position, but let alone the wide receiver position where you want instant production. And why do you want instant production out of your wide receiver room next year? You want to make sure that you have, I like to call them guaranteed results when you pull up to every stadium. You know what you're going to get, you know how you're going to get it, and who you can count on. And if you don't think it matters, when you watch the national championship game last year, Michael Penix Jr. knew who he could go to under pressure all season. Didn't work out much last night because Michigan said, we know what you're doing. But when J.J. McCarthy had to drop back and pass, he knew what tight end he could throw to and what number 1 or number 2 receiver, what they were going to do. What that does for a quarterback in your offense and your defense and special teams, it allows you to dictate the pace of the game and where it could go. So with that being said, we are going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about the men's and women's basketball team. But before that, Rico is going to tell us about Jase Medical.
Thanks, Jay. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of real life, but can we just talk for a minute about preparing for real life? According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. This is scary. I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if my wife or one of my kids got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from the life-saving medication they needed. Thankfully, we'll be okay because of Jase Medical. The Jase case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinuses, skin infections, among others. This stuff could happen to any of us. Visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to prepare than today. Go to jasemedical.com and use the offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. Back to you.
Welcome back to Locked On Huskers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As we mentioned before, we're going to talk about the men's and women's basketball team, which both had a up and down week. First, we'll talk about the men's basketball team. The midweek game against the University of Indiana Hoosiers, led by a veteran coach and also a team that is a blue blood. And people going into the game thought it was going to be a pivotal victory or a pivotal game in Nebraska's season. You know, have they arrived? Have they matured since the Creighton loss? Have they learned from the Minnesota loss, which they had control of the game and then seemingly went into halftime and almost essentially got the sleepers-itis, as I like to say, is that they came out so flat that they gave the game to Minnesota. It was a pivotal game. And I will say this, from the very start of the game, even though Nebraska didn't have true control of the game, they had true control of their emotions. And I talked a little bit about it earlier in the week on 93.7 The Ticket, that the guy that was going to be a pivotal player in the game was C.J. Wilcher. I think if you get him started early, I think he's an added bonus, and his offense leads to defensive presence, and it also brings an energy not only to the team but to the packed PBA arena. And so if you watch the game was back and forth. I felt like Nebraska played at the best pace that they've had maybe throughout Fred Hoiberg's coaching tenure here, which is been pretty long, but at the end, the poise that they played with, and they had multiple guys handling the ball. Rink Mass coming back there where he's kind of the point center, but the point of the offense, a little bit kind of like Derek Walker, but a different way, where Derek Walker, I feel like, was a point forward, point center that he could get downhill. He could pass out of the double team or traps, whereas Rink Mass can do that, but he can work at the 3-point line, the top of the key. And what does that do? I think they created a tremendous amount of spacing that hurt Indiana, even though they had a Wimby 2.0 looking like a young man in there, and Ware that had 20 points and like 9 or 10 rebounds. And of those 20 points, I'd like to say 12 of them came off dunks. And so that's an inside presence where they tried to implore a kryptonite to Nebraska. And so what I think Nebraska's game plan was to spread them out and make Indiana move their feet. Indiana was a bigger team, probably a more physical team as far as size, strength, and girth, whereas Nebraska is still a big team. But I think fleet of foot, Nebraska was able to get some angles on them and get in the paint just enough to even the score. Where Nebraska won the game was their perimeter defense, the lack of turnovers, and timely threes. And you don't get timely threes at the University of Nebraska's basketball team without Jase Tamanaga. And what he did was he was very patient. And so the difference I think you've seen seen from Jase, say from the middle of the season last year when he really took off to now, and where he's been more consistent, is he's a lot more patient. So he's doing a better job of using the picks and the screens and his energy to get open and angles, which then he's wearing down opponents, and then he's getting the open three, which is a great look for him, and you're expecting it to go in. It's not forced like maybe it was early in his career, playing with some pressure. And then he's able to, when he gets a little bit of opening, he gets a step back, and when he's feeling it, it's game time. And then when he's shooting and making it, and even the shots that he doesn't make, they're good shots and they're reboundable misses, you're able to get right back into your offense. Jamarcus Lawrence is be able to pick his spots. You're getting Williams going, who is actually the smooth operator. So he's probably in that Sam Griesel mode, but he has a little bit more outside game, consistent game. And then you're able to have your offense. And then you had timely turnovers, which led to fast break points. And then you saw it to where Nebraska had almost a 20-point lead and the game was over. And Indiana Hoosiers got put to sleep pretty quick. I think overall, in my opinion, I would say this game was probably the best game overall, start to finish, turnovers, rebounding, shooting, in Fred Hoiberg's coaching career, along with a pressure-packed season. And you got to think, one thing I think you always should evaluate Nebraska's basketball team on is free throw shooting. It was been Achilles' heel, it seems like, for the last decade. They were lights out from the from the free throw line, which then what does that do before we move on to the Wisconsin game? It allows you to extend leads. It allows you to stop runs. And that's what they're doing a lot better from the second half of last season all the way to this season, even through the losses to Creighton and Minnesota. So I think overall that's the best victory, in my estimation for this Nebraska basketball team. I know we've had no-sit Sundays and some really good victories against some highly ranked teams, but I think this playing-wise was one of their best victories, if not the best that they've had in Fred Hoiberg's career or coaching career here. Then on to those pesky Badgers. And on the road against Chucky Hedron-led Wisconsin Badgers, who had been up and down all season. Chucky Hedron had a little bit of an injury, and they had this is the first time they really attacked the transfer portal on the road, primetime game, and Nebraska went up there. And, I think this is like a game, I think last year when they went up to Michigan State, where they actually played good offensively. They shot 50% from three, or close to 50% from the field. The rebounding, numbers were right along, even Steven. So that's when you think Nebraska's going to win, as long as they don't get destroyed on the boards. The turnovers and all that, fast break points, about even. Where Nebraska lost this game was in the paint, 34-16 in paint points. Now, how do you get paint points? Back to the basket, points where they got busy on Nebraska, second chance points, where they really didn't, beat Nebraska. But what they did is they got into their secondary and third phases of their offense, which led to paint touches and paint scores. That's where Nebraska lost the game. Because when you look at it, compare Wisconsin's offensive stats to Nebraska stats, as far as shooting percentage, free throw percentage, 3-point percentage, they're right even. You have to dig a little bit deeper. So when you watch that game, Nebraska, you would say, looked flat starting out the game. Okay, they're on the road. Wisconsin's at home. They withstood the first blitz. Then they weren't able to recover. And it wasn't because of offense. Generally, that's what's happened. That's what the Minnesota game was. Absolutely zero offense when they were up there in Minneapolis. What really happened was Wisconsin started to give gut punches to Nebraska. And if you like boxing, the body blows were just too much and the paint touches. So that's something that Fred Hoiberg and those guys will go back to the drawing board and try to eliminate, obviously moving forward. They got a big game tonight against Purdue. See how they do with Zach Edney and the Purdue Boilermakers, who seems like he's been in college for like 85 years. He's the Aaron Kraft of the Purdue Boilermakers, but a good chance for Nebraska to rebound. I think Nebraska goes as Gary goes, as C.J. Wilcher goes, considering that they have some known guys, but you can get those guys going. Nebraska has a good chance to win. On to the women's team. Oddly enough, Nebraska's men beat an Indiana Hoosiers team earlier in the week. Nebraska's women were coming off a big victory, had a home game against a 14th ranked Indiana Hoosiers team, a big game for Amy Williams and crew. And it's a little bit like the Wisconsin game. It really is. I think he had some good individual performances. Alexis Markowski played well, had over 18 points and 9 or 10 rebounds. But I think sometimes what people need to understand, when you face an offense that gets hot, like the Indiana Hoosiers. And the thing about the Indiana Hoosiers, if Iowa wasn't on this Caitlin Clark run from last year to this year, Ohio State and Indiana would be the belle of the ball of the Big Ten Conference for the last 4 or 5 years. So why am I telling this? The Indiana Hoosiers, even when Nebraska had their really, really good teams in the tournament teams from a couple years ago, who was their Achilles heel? Indiana Hoosiers. Why? Because Indiana Hoosiers can handle them in their foot speed, their three-point shooting, and their inside presence. They have a well-rounded program, and it was a good matchup for Nebraska women's basketball team. And he felt like they matched up pretty well, right? You got Jazz Shelley, Alexis Markowski, and a host of others, and you have your two knowns, your in and outside presence. But what Indiana got was excellent three-point shooting, transition offense that was led by the inside presence, and then also the kick out and open threes. And they end up not upsetting Nebraska on the road, but beating them pretty handily at home. Had control of the game, I would say, from the middle of the second quarter all the way to finish, based on those things that I mentioned before. And so I think it's a learning experience for Amy Williams and the Huskers. I think they will get better from it, but then also I think that they will be able to bounce back and finish out this Big Ten season and make a possible tournament run. Because the one thing about the Big Ten, both men's and women's basketball teams and the schedules, it's a grind. You're not going to be able to go undefeated in the Big Ten. The competition is too thick. There's too many good players. There's too many good coaches. And when you face a team, and I call them a like-minded team, a likewise team, and that team or the Huskers get hot, the other opposing team will lose. So with that being said, that is the recap of the men's and women's basketball teams. I'm sure they will bounce back after 2 losses and move down and move up in the Big Ten rankings and push towards the NCAA tournament berth. Up next, a polar bear sighting in Lincoln. But first, Rico, tell us about FanDuel.
Thanks, Jay. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab, make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, which is the best way to find popular parlays, and much more. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Back to you.
As I mentioned, we had a polar bear sighting in Lincoln, Nebraska. What is that? A polar bear, right? Who is that? That is Nash Hutmacher, the starting defensive tackle for the Nebraska football team, that has decided to better himself by going. And at first, it started out that he just wanted to work with the wrestling team to get back into wrestling shape that would eventually help him out on the football field. But Nash, I think, in his high school career, wrestling career, was undefeated in 4 years. I think 146-0, which is crazy. To where I know that they could say, "Oh, well, you're heavyweight. There's not too many heavyweights," but to go 146-0 in your high school career, well established. Mark Manning had recruited him as a wrestling recruit prior, but then also you have to think that he chose to play football. So when he decided to do this in the off season after a year to where he was honorable mention, all Big Ten, had some, I guess, big or small talks about potentially going to the NFL. He's chose to even take even more chance, or to put the chips in to be a better player, to try wrestling, see if he still has it, and use wrestling in the I guess the practices, the techniques to become a better football player. I will tell you this. From my experiences going against offensive linemen, some of the hardest guys I had to go against were the former wrestlers. Why? Because they had a tremendous amount of balance. They were individually motivated. They were mean. They were nasty, and they never got tired. And so I think when you look at Nash as a football player, where he made huge strides this year in order to be consistent. Every single game, he was making plays, tackles for losses, sacks, was the job that he did as far as reshaping his body, which then allowed him to be in better shape. Now he wants to take it even further, right? So you got to give credit to Corey Campbell, initially the football, obviously a weight coach and their weight staff, Matt Rule to being open to it, Mark Manning to saying, hey, listen, I can help him become a better football player, and he can help out our wrestling team, which is ranked number 4 in the nation. He went against another freshman in Wyoming, and I'm sure Nash. Listen, I'm sure he was nervous. He had the whole football staff, recruits in town. You're out there in a singlet, so you're you're out there live on stage. And he went out there, and he felt at home, and I watched it. Every single second. He's tough. He's hard to move. Definitely has Division I talent, Power 5 talent to be a wrestler. I understated his record. He was 166-0. I apologize, Nash. I apologize, Polar Bear. I don't want you to come after me like you did the young man from Wyoming. But he went out there and not only passed with phenomenal, glowing, colors. He was able to get a pin in his first match in 3 or 4 years. And when you saw him, he had to get down to 285. That takes a lot of dedication. And the one thing about wrestlers, they have to be dedicated to their craft. You talk about sacrifice. You're not able to partake in some of the things that I enjoy right now, is eating freely, drinking freely, no alcoholic beverages, by the way, but just being able to do the things you want to do. You have to cut weight. And for Nash, that was probably 310 pounds. And even if he had to get down to 285, that's a 25-pound drop, all the while keeping strength, endurance, and mental focus to go out there when you are facing anxiety in an arena that you hadn't been in a very, very long time. So big shout out to Nash. Big shout out to Mark Manning and the wrestling staff, which made his debut as a wrestler not only a hit, but I think it's brought new life to the wrestling program and the football program. So with that being said, that is Jay Foreman, or I'm Jay Foreman, our first Locked On Huskers. I want to thank you for making Locked On Huskers your first watch and listen, and make Locked On Sports your second listen. Without signing off, please like, subscribe, and share. The more, the merrier. You will be seeing this face, whether you like it or not, for quite some time. But I appreciate you guys listening to Locked On Huskers. This is Jay Foreman signing off.